We have a practice in our office that when we go to a hearing on the merits and the client is going to testify in Spanish using the court interpreter, Hector accompanies me. He's a native speaker so that he can listen to what our client is actually saying on the stand and then what the interpreter is saying, because as I said, this often could be an issue, and especially this can make an issue on appeal if the interpretation is so lacking in clarity and quality. That can be an issue before the Board of Immigration Appeals. So Hector, why don't you tell some of what you observed on Tuesday at this hearing?
The problem in this, with this translator, I believe, was that she wasn't a native speaker and her syntax was just very convoluted. It wasn't that it wasn't good Spanish or grammatically correct, it was that it just wasn't a way a native speaker would have phrased that. And so it made the interpretation very convoluted. There were many instances where the witness would say things that were just not translated at all. In other instances, there were some times where in Spanish we phrase our sentences with subject, verb, object. And in Spanish, it is quite often the native speakers will merge both the subject and the verb. And so to a native speaker, because of the way the ending of the word is phrased, we know what the subject is. For example, ellos me dijeron, they told me. Can also be said me dijeron, which completely omits the ellos, which is the subject. And this happened frequently in this instance where our witness would conjugate verbs in such a manner that the subject would be conjugated with the verb. And this was lost in translation. So many times the judge would ask, who? Or whom are you referring to? And it was the way she had phrased her sentences that it described it. And then the problem was that the translator did not, in her translation of it, did not really accurately reflect this.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was surprising too about this particular hearing, was that the judge found that the client was not credible. I hadn't even really prepared our client for that, because every time I've met with her, I found her story to be very believable and the way that she told it to be very believable. So when we got to court, I had said, look, your chances are difficult because of the legal issues in your case. There's legal issues about being a victim of domestic violence, and there's a thing called matter of AB, which has to do with the law of asylum for victims of domestic violence. So we had talked about that, but I really did not foresee that the judge would just not even believe my client. And I think too, yes, a lot of these arose because of the poor translation. And what Hector was just saying, that sometimes the subject of a sentence would get so obscured that at the end of the translation, the judge would be looking, saying who, what, where. So there was really a problem with the translation. One other thing I'll say too is back to this whole idea of it's used a lot, but it's true that in that courtroom, there was so much white privilege at work. It is the idea of when worlds collide. I don't feel like the judge, she was coming from such a first world perspective and was unaware of even some of the things that she was doing. For example, our client, when she left Honduras, she left in a hurry and had to basically flee for her life. And she had to make a very difficult decision, which I call Sophie's choice, where you have to decide what you're going to do with your children. And so she made a decision that she had 2 small children, and she was advised with people she was traveling with that it would be very difficult to bring them with her. So she decided to leave them with her mother for safekeeping. So on Tuesday in court, when the judge found out that she had left her children there, the judge really shamed her for it. The judge did things like look at her with very wide eyes and say, "You mean to tell me you haven't seen your children for over a year?" She said it that way. And obviously the client felt ashamed and could get that she was being basically, reprimanded for having left her children there. So there was that feeling that the client, also the reason that she was so soft-spoken, and probably the reason that some of the difficulty with the interpretation had to do with this client is not very educated, is a person of very humble background, and so she was hesitant in talking and soft-spoken in talking, and also not grammatically correct in talking. And so those things all work together to make it a bad interpretation, and also a bad impression that the judge felt she wasn't even telling the truth when she was telling about these horrendous things. I'll just end with one more example of this, how these things all came together. For example, when she was on the witness stand and I was questioning our client about her history of domestic violence that her husband or her partner had carried out against her. And then when I said, and when did this all begin? When was the first time that he was abusive? There was some miscommunication there. She thought the question was about the first time that she was ever abused. So she began to answer the question saying, at 10 years old, I was raped. And then instead of the judge saying, wait, you didn't understand the question, the judge became angry and said, why are you going back to something that happened when you're 10 years old? That wasn't the question. And of course that, have someone come back at you like that when the client has opened herself up to talking about one of the most horrendous things that ever happened in her life, and then have a judge bark back at her, wait, stop, you're not saying the right thing. It just set a very bad feeling in the whole courtroom, and it really hurt my client's ability to get her story across. So in the end, the judge denied her request for asylum, and my client has the right to appeal. In many cases, we would appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals. But now, because of this policy of the Trump administration of keeping people detained long-term, indefinitely, and including asylum seekers who prior to the Trump administration, had much more of an ability to be free while they're pursuing their case, the fact is that I had to advise my client, you can appeal. Your appeal might take 1 to 2 years, but you will be detained here in this facility while you're waiting. So for that, as you can imagine, it has a very chilling effect on anybody that's thinking of filing appeal to know that you're going to be in jail. So my client informed me that she did not want to appeal, and now she is facing deportation to Honduras.